Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, Wil'liam Hall, broadcasting to you live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with episode number 25 of Rabbi Michael Skobac's Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament. Tonight we'll be going over Matthew chapter 22. And so coming to you from our northern countryside, where it's definitely much cooler for Sukkot, Canada. You know, I've got to come visit you, Rabbi. It's got to happen. Or you have to come down here again so I can catch you. You know what I mean?
I'll come down when it goes below 80.
You know what? I am so looking forward to that day. We have, oh man, I just realized I got on my old dirty work hat. That's okay. I'll play the sleight of hand when we switch screens. I'll reach over and grab it.
No one will notice.
No one will ever notice. That's good. Yeah. So you say that the weather up there is quite
it's delightful. We don't usually get to say that here in Toronto.
I know, right?
But it's delightful.
You know, I have to tell the viewers too. It's been very interesting the last 2 or 3 years. It's been pretty systematic in the sense that Sukkot time comes around. It's usually the fall time frame usually hits like pretty much during that week, which is really cool. Literally also. But this year it hasn't actually happened yet. The nights are cooling off, but only after about, I don't know, 9, 10 o'clock, it seems to start making temperature change. And it's like 94 today, I guess, Rabbi?
That's brutal.
That's just torture for fall. You know, they need to fire the groundhog and get a new one. Because
you should get your money back.
Exactly. So Sukkot for you has just been really wonderful, yes?
Well, we had rain, on the second day of Sukkot, but it's just been really nice. Today was absolutely perfect, sunny, about, 70 degrees approximately in Fahrenheit. It was really, really nice.
Wow.
That's really nice. Yeah.
Yeah. I envy your location and temperature for now. So.
For now.
And all those Texans who
check back with me in a few months and you won't envy us.
You know, it's funny. I'm already not envying you. Okay. So I'm kind of playing around with the new cameras. So, hey folks, I don't know which camera is this? That's the sky cam. Oh, cool. Hi. Anyway, so and then the side cam. Sometimes I do this, Rabbi, because hey, we got to test the system, test the equipment. Where's the other one? Oh, there it is. This is where I was going to put you. I'm going to show you just for fun, Rabbi. This is the one that I was going to. Actually, I did. We tested that. Where are you? There you are. Oh, you're on the sky cam one. That's what it was. It showed backwards on that screen. Oh, anyway. Well. That's okay. Well, we are here for business, and Matthew chapter 22. Rabbi, can you believe we've already done 25 episodes?
It's unbelievable.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's almost half a year.
Yeah, that's really neat. It seems like it's going to take about 4 more years to get through Matthew. But
No. Actually, with Matthew, we're about to finish Matthew, but the question is what happens after that. Which will try and work out between now and the end of Matthew.
And just for the viewers, oh, I'm still here. It says, oh, I forgot to turn the video off. 1 second. Okay.
Yeah, that was spooky looking.
That was weird. I didn't lose my connection on this end, but it did. But it went quiet there for a second. It's because I forgot to turn the video off. The feed I was giving you to see what I was doing on my end, and so apparently I can't do that during a broadcast. Lesson learned.
Okay, lesson learned. So
yes.
Last time we met, we started the journey into Jerusalem, which is, this is going to be the final week or so of the life of Jesus. And so really we're now, sort of coming around the bend to the climax of the story. And it begins this week with a parable, another one of the parables of, it's called a parable of the wedding feast. And I don't know, I didn't really see many commentaries written by Christians that really address the problem I'm going to mention now. But I found the beginning of this chapter difficult to understand because it begins by saying that Jesus answered, presumably he's answering someone, and spoke to them. Who was he speaking to? Again, he spoke to them again by parables and gave this parable of the king who makes a wedding banquet for his son. Now, normally, if we're beginning chapter 22 now, and it says Jesus answered and he spoke to them, presumably he's continuing from the end of chapter 21. But I just find it very, very difficult because if you just go back to the very end of chapter 21, we saw last week that he had, in this continuing saga of run-ins between Jesus and the rabbinic leaders and the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees. So at the end of last chapter 21, it says that in verse 45, when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, and they perceived that he was talking about them, I guess,
Right.
it wasn't so oblique, meaning that he was pretty clear that he was trying to, poke at them. So it says they were trying to arrest him, and they feared the throngs because they regarded him as a prophet, meaning that the last chapter we studied ended with, him already engaging the rabbinic and the Jewish leaders with his parables that were designed really to knock them. And it says that they, this disturbed them and they were trying to arrest him, have him arrested. So it sounds like, they really were no longer talking to each other at that point. I mean, if they get disturbed to the point where they're trying to arrest him and have him thrown into jail, so why is this conversation continuing? But so I just found that the beginning of this week's chapter is hard to understand because it just seems to imply that he was continuing his discussion, with these very same people that in the previous verse says they were trying to throw him into jail. You wouldn't think they'd just stand here continuing to speak to him at this point.
Sure.
So anyway, he presents this parable. And again, we have to remember what Jesus has said previously, or what the Gospels say about Jesus' parables, because his own disciples asked him, why is he always speaking in parables? He doesn't ever seem to give a straight answer to questions that are asked of him. And he always seems to launch into a story or a parable. So he says that I'm teaching in parables so that only you guys will understand what I'm saying, but I don't want other people to understand what I'm talking about.
Right.
So again, you have to really question what's going on here, that he's continuing this discussion with the chief priests and the Pharisees and the scribes, and he's telling them these parables, and they're not supposed to understand it, and yet they seem to have penetrated pretty quickly what he was talking about. So here he gives a parable about the kingdom of heaven, and we've discussed in the past that this is one of the few things, one of the things that I think we can comfortably say that Jesus would have been speaking about, meaning that if someone who has been claiming to be the Messiah, in the first century in Israel, this is exactly what you would think the Messiah would be talking about, the coming kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, because just about one of the most central basic things that the Tanakh, that the Hebrew scriptures speak about when it speaks about the Messianic age, is that it'll be a time when the entire world will come to faith in God. The entire world will come to acknowledge God as a creator, as the ruler of the entire universe. And so this is, again, par for the course, really. And it's just not clear, I think we're going to see this tonight, whether or not this parable really was spoken by Jesus. Because again, this is one of the primary problems with studying the Gospels, is to try to discern, what is actually something that Jesus might have said, and what was really written afterwards, and probably 30, 40, 50 years afterwards by people that may never have met Jesus and are writing these narratives with an agenda. So here the story is pretty simple. There's a king who arranges a marriage for his son, and most of the commentaries seem to assume just straight off the bat that the king here is the Almighty God and the son is Jesus. And he sends out his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding, apparently sent out a whole list of people to come to the wedding. And many Christian commentaries say that the people who were first invited to the wedding were Israel, because Jesus initially comes and calls on Israel only. But they were not willing to come. So they said this parable, many Christian commentaries see as a, describing how the Jewish people did not respond to the claim that Jesus is making about himself, and that God is allegedly confirming through the miracles that he's allowing Jesus to do. And so, the question again is, is this really a parable that Jesus is telling people at the time, or is this written afterward? Because as we'll see in a minute, when the story goes on, he sends out other servants saying, well, tell those who were invited, see, I prepared my dinner, my oxen, my fatted cattle are all killed, and all things are ready. So come to the wedding. So I guess God here is persisting that the Jewish people should come to accept his son Jesus, the Messiah. But then it says they made light of it, and they went their ways, one to his own farm, another to his business. So some people just ignored Jesus, and then the rest seized his servants, treated them spitefully, and killed them. So apparently what the parable here is saying is that some of these messengers who came to tell the Jewish people about the Messiah were treated terribly and even killed by the Jewish people. But when the king heard about it, he was furious, and he sent out his armies and destroyed those murderers and burnt up their city. Now, many people take this as a describing the destruction of Jerusalem, meaning after the nation of Israel did not really come to faith in Jesus. The Christian narrative is to look what God did. Mm-hmm. 40 years later, he destroys Jerusalem. So it seems that, at least on some level, this could very well have been a parable, a story that only became relevant, and it was only told a long time after Jesus was killed. And it's quite possible Jesus never really spoke in these terms. But this is the kind of narrative that the followers of Jesus began themselves speaking about, meaning that they were now looking after the destruction of the temple and using that as a polemic against Israel, against the Jewish people, and saying, look, we're right and you guys are wrong because the temple was destroyed. And then in verse 8, the parable goes on. He says to his servants, the wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. So apparently this is now saying Israel is not worthy. Therefore, go into the highways, and as many as you find, invite to the wedding. Now, again, some Christian commentaries take this as now the invitation to not just Israel, but to the nations of the world, to the gospel. Again, and the Great Commission only was given after the death of Jesus, and really didn't really take place until the ministry of Paul. So I think it's quite possible that what we're reading here is a story, that's written already after Paul has begun his missionary journeys in the 50s, after the destruction of the temple around the year 70. And now you have already probably the beginnings of the split between the Gentile church that Paul has started and the Jewish people. It's basically, things have basically gone south in terms of this relationship. And now this story is being put back into the mouth of Jesus.
Can you comment real briefly on the concept of the timing of the destruction of the temple? because I've heard so many people actually comment on that very topic, saying, well, the reason why this, and this happened is because, after Jesus died and resurrected, the sacrifices were no longer accepted and the temple was destroyed. And it seems to me like it would be much more punctual, that God would not be that late in having the destruction of the temple 30 some odd years later after the supposed resurrection. Would I be right on that?
Yeah, really 40 years later.
Okay.
Well, what some Christian apologists have said is that 40 years is a generation, and God gave them a generation before he destroyed the temple. It's interesting that I think we've mentioned this before already, that we see that it wasn't just the Jewish people who continued to go to the temple and offer sacrifices in the temple after the death of Jesus, but we see from the book of Acts that even the Jewish followers of Jesus kept on going to the temple, bringing sacrifices. As a matter of fact, when they tested Paul, they wanted Paul to prove that he was someone who was Torah observant. They insisted that he sponsor the sacrifices of these men who had become Nazarites, and now the term of being a Nazarite had concluded. And as we see in Numbers chapter 6, the person who concluded the period of time of being a Nazarite had to bring sacrifices to the temple, including sin offerings.
Right.
So you see pretty clearly.
And he shaved his head, which is what Paul did in the New Testament,
but the problem is that the normal Christian narrative is that the death of Jesus was the final sacrifice, and after that, the book, the New Testament says there are no more sacrifices for sin. And yet, here you see, in the 50s, the followers of Jesus, like James and Peter and John, are in Jerusalem. They're going to the temple, and they're insisting that Paul actually sponsor the sacrifices of these Nazarites that included bringing a sin offering. And it's strange. Like, why, of all the things they could have asked Paul to do, they chose that. They could have asked him to put on phylacteries. They could have, asked him to, do any number of things. The Torah has hundreds of commandments. Why did they pick, the one commandment that they did, where they had to actually engage in bringing sin offerings into the temple? So it is a little bit strange, and also it's interesting that it doesn't work out with the timeline of Daniel 9, because according to the way Daniel 9 should have read from a Christian perspective, it speaks about the cutting off of the Anointed One and the city being destroyed. They take place simultaneously. And in the chronology that you have here, you have Jesus being cut off around the year 3033, but Jerusalem is not destroyed until 40 years later.
Right.
And Daniel seems to be speaking about the two things happening simultaneously. So it is problematic in terms of the timing here. So I'm just suggesting that since we're reading a story parable here now that speaks about so many things that were not really relevant during the life of Jesus. We know that Jerusalem had not been destroyed yet. We know that the gospel message did not go out to the Gentiles yet. I think it's quite possible, again, I can't prove this, I'm just speculating, that this is the kind of story that Jesus may not have spoken, and these are words that may have been put into his mouth later on by people who already had been impacted by the message of Paul, and the later development in the spread of Christianity. What's interesting, and you'll see this in many Christian commentaries, is they actually take that very perspective. Because what happens here is that when the king comes in to see the guests, he saw that there was a man who didn't have a wedding garment. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. So in verse 12, he says to this fellow, how come you didn't come here with your tuxedo on? And the fellow is speechless. So the king said to the servants, bind him hand and foot, take him away, and cast him into outer darkness, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen. So you have a commentary like John MacArthur, who I've mentioned in the past, probably one of the most popular evangelical commentaries today. So I'm going to share with you what he says. He says, the imagery here, he says, is regarding those who identify with the kingdom externally. They profess to be Christians. They profess to belong to a church, yet they spurn the garment of righteousness that Jesus offers, seeking to establish a righteousness of their own. Now, many of the commentaries do see this idea of the garment as symbolizing a person's righteous works. That would be more in line with what someone like James taught, right? That faith without works is dead, which would probably be a more meaningful interpretation back in the first century. But someone like John MacArthur, really his whole interpretation already comes the whole perspective of an organized church and almost a whole established religion where you have the kind of people who go to church every week, but don't really internalize the message of
Right.
spiritual message of Christianity. Now, I think as we're going to go through the rest of this chapter, we're going to see that I believe it's one of the chapters that really, I think, highlights how questionable the historicity of the Gospels are. I find this chapter to be particularly problematic in terms of having any credibility in terms of, did this really happen? Or are these stories being written with an agenda? So in verse 15, I think that's where we are now,
Okay.
we're told, then the Pharisees went and plotted how they might entangle him in his talk. Now, I mentioned before that this is, one of the most absurd kind of phrases to have, the Pharisees. There were thousands and thousands of Pharisees, and it's unlikely that they all came, with this together at this point, and they had a big convention somewhere in Jerusalem to plot how they might entangle him. It would have been much more credible had the gospel writer said some of the Pharisees came and plotted. It just doesn't really make much sense to speak about this group, in their entirety. And again, it happens throughout the Gospels. Unfortunately, there's a tendency to try and generalize and stereotype entire groups of Jewish people. We're going to see when we look at the Gospel of John, he writes about the Jews, the Jews. I mean, that any time someone speaks to you about an entire group, they're all like this, just from the starting gate that it's just not true.
Right.
You don't have the ability to generalize about any such group. And it's interesting, we're going to see next week when in Matthew 23, where he really laces into the Pharisees. The truth is that there were thousands and thousands and thousands of Pharisees. You can't generalize about them all, and they themselves criticized each other. Certainly within any religious group, you'll find that there are some who don't live up to the ideals of the group. So, if Jesus had criticized or had spoken about some, or there were of the Pharisees, just speak about, a reasonable number that came together here to challenge him. But, anytime you use that kind of phraseology, the Pharisees, and again, it gives the impression to the Christian reader over the course of Christian history, that's how a group gets stereotyped. And that's why, again, you go to any dictionary and look up the word Pharisees, look at a Merriam-Webster dictionary or any other kind of major dictionary, the word Pharisee has become defined as a religious hypocrite.
Right.
Now, that only happened because of the gospel writings. And, it simply isn't fair, and it's actually, it's ugly. I would say it's ugly. I don't know, if this really reflects on, you know, the credibility of the story. We'll see not just the stereotyping, but we'll see the way the stories play out. They really don't have this. They don't sound solid, and they sound really very hollow in terms of the truthful factor here. And we'll see. I'll try and point out the problems in the story. So here, the Pharisees were told, went and they plotted against him, how they can entangle him in his talk, and they sent to him their disciples with some of the Herodians. These were people who were loyal to the Herodian line, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are true, and teach the way of God in truth. Nor do you care about anyone, for you do not regard the persons of men. So tell us, therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Now, one thing is very clear here, and this is, again, one of the themes that we've discussed many times in our series so far. You know, one of the very, very basic teachings of historical Christianity is that Jesus is God, and that Jesus claimed to be God. Now, we've seen many, many passages here in Matthew where it doesn't really seem to be the case. And I think this is a great example of where it doesn't really seem to be the case here, that Jesus claimed to be God, that Jesus' followers thought he was God, that Jesus' followers were praying to him as God. Because if that was the case, if it was clear that Jesus really saw himself as God, claimed to be God, his followers worshipped and prayed to him as God, you wouldn't have this group of Pharisees and Herodians trying to, you know, scrape together some kind of tax evasion scheme.
Right.
I think that they could nail him on a much more serious charge. You know, why get involved with this? And we'll see. It's a clumsy question to begin with. But if this is what the problem was, if there really was this clear teaching by Jesus that he was claiming to be God and that people should worship him, you know, that's really what they should have focused on, and they should have tried to trap him, you know, if they didn't have direct evidence. So, you know, maybe get some people pretending to follow him and say, "Listen, we know that you're the Messiah. Are you also God? Should we worship you and pray to you?" That would have been something worth trapping him on.
Rabbi, there is a really provocative video that I saw. The first time that I saw it surface on YouTube, on Facebook, I was still a Messianic. And of course, I didn't watch it then. You don't want to watch anything that might shun the name, you know. But actually, later I came to the decision I needed to start watching a lot of this stuff, like some crazy guy named Rabbi Michael Skobac. But anyway, that's beside the point. This video is called Caesar's Messiah, and something that I watched it 3 times. The first time I watched it is when I first came out, and it was I was thinking, no way, just somebody's trying to debunk. You know, everybody's trying to debunk someone else. I mean, you've got debunking videos for debunked videos. I mean, it's really crazy out there. But the information they shared was just so incredibly, almost like shattering in your mind, because it's like they point out things just like you did about why even bring up something like that if the whole point of this is to show people how to worship God in the sense of things, you know. And so it's really, for people who haven't seen it, at least watch it. That way you can say, I watched the video. Caesar's Messiah on YouTube. Look it up. It's really cool.
I have still not watched it.
You will like it.
Okay.
You will like it.
Yeah, anything that's 3 hours long, I generally shy away from. That's why I try so hard to keep these shows under an hour. We're definitely not gonna do it tonight.
Rabbi, that's why I like your post on Facebook. They're about a paragraph long. I can do that.
So the reason it's such a clumsy question here is that this was not really much of a controversial topic. You know, they're asking if it's lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not. The story goes on here in verse 18. Jesus perceived their wickedness, and said, "Why do you test me, you hypocrites? Show me the tax money. What are you talking about? Paying what tax money?" It's interesting, by the way, because according to most scholars and most commentaries to the New Testament, one of Jesus's disciples was a tax collector. I think Matthew,
Right. Matthew.
according to most, was a tax collector. So they brought him a denarius, and he said to them, "Whose image and inscription is this?" And they said, "It's Caesar's." So he said to them, "Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." Which is, it sounds like almost a slippery kind of thing to say, but I think the simplest way of understanding it is, look, he's saying, if there is a requirement to pay taxes to Caesar, you pay taxes to Caesar, and what you need to do in the service of God and the worship of God, you do there. And it's not one or the other. And the truth is that this is exactly standard Jewish policy. The standard Jewish rabbinic teaching has always been what we call Dina de Malchusa Dina. The law of the land is the law. And if you're living in a land where the law requires that you pay taxes, you pay taxes. So this would not have been a controversial question. And the story ends by saying, when they heard these words, they marveled, and they left him and they went their way. Now, there's nothing marvelous about this answer. This is sort of like any sixth grade civics student back then would have known this. And again, it's one of the reasons why when I read a story like this, it doesn't inspire me to believe this story is true. Because, you have this sort of simple question, which is not much of a question. It's not really a great way to entangle him. They're asking him a pretty non-controversial question. They could have had much, much better things to trap him with. To me, the indication is that he wasn't claiming to be God, and he wasn't being worshipped by his disciples as God. And that's why they didn't bother going in that direction. I would wonder why they even bothered going in this direction, because, any Jewish leader would have given almost the same exact answer. So it's not really clear how this was a trap. Now, obviously, it wasn't popular to pay these taxes. We know that the tax collectors were not popular people. They weren't beloved people, and the Jews really resented paying it was a pretty steep tax as well. But they didn't have a choice. The Romans are ruling the country. They were providing services. So the clear Jewish teaching was that you had to pay these taxes, and he's basically saying nothing that's unusual or controversial here. So I can't really see why this declaration he makes would have astonished anyone. And so what happens at this point, and I think it's the rest of the chapter, is that Matthew seems to be trying to portray the Jewish leaders, both the Sadducees and the Pharisees, as sort of clueless buffoons. That's really how it seems the gospel writers are trying to portray them. It reminds me, in the past, I've been interviewed in many newspaper articles, and I would always have a kick trying to look at the articles afterward and see how little connection there was between what I said to the reporters and what was actually written. Sometimes they actually wrote exactly the opposite of what I said. So when I read this kind of presentation in the New Testament, it's a red light for me, meaning that when they have, these sort of exchanges where Jesus says something simplistic and everybody is going, "Oh, wow, that's the most amazing thing in the world," and they scratch their heads, and he shuts them up, and they're astounded and they're astonished. It just doesn't seem, it doesn't really, at least to me, it doesn't ring true. It doesn't have the ring of truth to it. And it sounds like what you have here is an attempt to simply present Jesus, mowing down his opposition, making all the Jewish leaders seem foolish and stupid and inept and like the buffoons. Obviously, this is what you have going on here. Now, I'm not clear that this actually happened during the lifetime of Jesus. But, again, we know that later on, there was a serious split between, the growing Christian movement under the leadership of Paul and the general Jewish world, as well as Paul's movement splitting away from the Jewish followers of Jesus. And, so it wouldn't be so unusual to try to present the Jewish leadership as clueless and as buffoons.
Sure.
In the next portion, you have an attack against the Sadducees. And so here again, the Sadducees would be, the kind of phrase which doesn't make much sense. I'm sure that he wasn't speaking here to all the Sadducees that lived at that time. There must have been a group of Sadducees. And we know that the Sadducees did not believe in the idea of the resurrection of the dead. The old joke is that's why they were sad, you see. And and it's interesting because we know from the Talmud, I'll share this in a few minutes, the Pharisaical teachers constantly had run-ins with the Sadducees over this question of the resurrection of the dead. And so here you have an interchange between Jesus and the Sadducees, and they ask him a question. It's quite possible that they would have asked the same question of the Pharisaical leaders. So they say, look, in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, Moses said that if a man dies, this is a law of the Torah, and a man dies without children, his brother should marry his wife to raise up offspring for the brother. The brother's name should not be erased.
Levirate marriage, is that right?
What's that?
Is that referring to the Levirate marriage?
Levirate marriage, yes.
Okay,
and so they give him a weird case where someone dies and his brother marries the woman, but the second brother dies, and they describe a case where there's 7 brothers, and each one of them die, which is a pretty weird case. This doesn't really seem to be working. So they ask him, in the resurrection, they're saying, if you're claiming that there is going to be resurrection of the dead, so they ask him, whose wife of the 7 will she be? Because they all had been married to her. So it's sort of it reminds me of those questions they would ask in the 1800s when, they wanted to keep people out from voting. They had these voting tests. They would ask these goofy, tricky questions, like if the plane's flying from New York to Los Angeles and it crashes in Colorado, where do they bury the survivors?
Right.
Or what's the color of Ulysses Grant's white horse? And so it sounds like one of these kind of questions. So Jesus basically says to them, look, you're mistaken in 2 ways. Number one, you don't realize that in the resurrection, people are not going to be physical like they are now with the resurrection of the dead. He's claiming they're not going to be marrying and having marriage and living like that. But he says people will be more spiritual, like angels in heaven. This is actually not such a simple discussion. This is a huge question that's discussed at great length among rabbinic commentaries. What is going to actually happen in the future? Maimonides takes the position that there will be a resurrection of the dead. People actually will come back in their bodies. But he says that then they'll die and that's going to be it. Then once they die, they'll just exist as a soul. People like Nachmanides, the Ramban, say that no, when people are resurrected, they will then live forever in a reconstituted body. So it won't be the kind of physical bodies we have now. It'll be more spiritual kind of body, but it will be a body. But the Talmud does say, whether or not we go like Maimonides or Nachmanides, that we're not going to be living the same kind of physical lives we live now. We're not going to have, there won't be eating and drinking and procreating. That's not going to be going on after the resurrection of the dead. So he basically gives them that answer, which is appropriate. And then he tries to show them that if they actually study the Bible properly, and we know that the Sadducees were people who did not accept the oral Torah, and they really didn't put a lot of emphasis on the prophetic books, but they did accept the 5 books of Moses. So he says to them, if you really had studied the 5 books of Moses properly, you would see that God says, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. I am the God, meaning that not that I was the God of those people who passed away. So his implication is that since he's speaking about in the present tense being their God, he's basically saying that they must in some way still be alive, meaning that it's really hard to understand exactly what he means here. Is he saying that Abraham at the present time has already been resurrected and is living in heaven as an angel, or that it's speaking about in the future? It's an attempt to try to prove from the 5 books of Moses that that there will be a resurrection of the dead. I don't think it's the most elegant proof to use. And he says here that when the multitudes heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. Again, it's hard for me to really take this without a grain of salt, meaning that what he's saying is, not controversial. It's not rocket science. There would have been standard fare for any Pharisaical person to say that, the resurrection will not be exactly like the physical life we have in this world. And the kind of proof he gives is not really that much more compelling than the proofs that the Pharisees already offered to the Sadducees. Let me just share 1 or 2 of them. But there are really many. I mean, you go through the Talmud, there are many, many confrontations between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. So one is offered by someone named Rava. So Rava pointed out that in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32, verse 39, the verse says there, God says, I kill and I give life. And it also says, I wounded and I will heal. So the passage in the Talmud, this is from Tractate Pesachim. I think we're in about 68, page 68a. So the Talmud says that in the verse here it says, I kill and I give life. I kill and I give life. So the rabbis themselves say, you might say that this means I kill one person and give life to another person. In the way of the world where people die and people are being born. So maybe the verse wouldn't prove that people are resurrected. But that's why the verse continues and says, I wound and I will heal. Now, when God says I wound and I heal, the Talmud says just as the wounding and the healing obviously refer to the same person, meaning the wounded person is the one who will be healed, so do death and life refer to the same person, meaning the person who died will be revived. That's one proof that the Pharisaical rabbis try to bring from the 5 books of Moses. There are many others that they offer, not just scriptural proofs. They try to bring logical proofs as well. Another scriptural proof is the verse where God says to Moses in Deuteronomy 31:16, you are soon to lie with your fathers and rise up. So they take this as maybe revealing that Moses one day will be risen up. We know, of course, there are passages in Daniel and Isaiah about the resurrection, but clearly the Sadducees were more interested in proofs from the 5 books of Moses. And then they have logical proofs that there'll be a resurrection of the dead. So here's a story where, and this is in Tractate Sanhedrin, 90a, I believe, a certain Sadducee came to Gavia ben Psia, and he says, you people are wicked because you say that the dead will be restored to life. And he made fun of it. So this Gavia replied, "You're really wicked because you say that the dead will not be restored to life." So the proof he gives is like this. He says, even if those who did not exist come to life, meaning we know that there are babies who didn't exist and then they're born as babies. So even those who did not exist come to life. Doesn't it stand to reason that those who once lived surely will live again? That's a logical answer that the Pharisees tried to give the Sadducees. But it's a very, very frequent encounter you find in the Talmud itself. What's interesting, though, is that Matthew here tries to give the indication that the Sadducees were bowled over by this, right? When it says, when the multitudes heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. Clearly, the Sadducees were not astonished by his teachings, because we know the Sadducees did not ever begin proclaiming that they accepted the idea of the resurrection after this encounter. So moving on to verse 34, this is one of the most puzzling pieces in this chapter. When the Pharisees, all 20,000 of them, when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, again, he didn't silence the Sadducees. The Sadducees did not roll over and die when he
right.
when he gave him that retort. So here the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees. They gathered together. Again, it's obviously speaking about a small group of Pharisees. And then one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him. And they said, "Teacher, which is the great commandment of the Torah?" In the New King James Study Bible that I have, they said the test here was a question designed to reveal how much Jesus knew about the Torah. I just find this to be very amusing. If you're going to try and test someone about how much they know about the Torah law, you're not going to ask them, "What do you think the greatest commandment in the Torah is?" It reminds me, there was a movie called Yentl, where Barbara Streisand,
Right, I remember that. That was good.
Tried to pass for a male yeshiva student. And so they wanted to show like a entrance exam into the yeshiva, because it was very common in yeshivot, even today, you don't just walk in, you have to prove that you're worthy. So I remember in the Yentl story, she goes for her entrance exam to the yeshiva, and the old rabbi says to her, he begins a quote from the Talmud, and he says, "Who is the wise man?" And, Yentl answers and says, "The one that can learn from everyone." That's obviously not the kind of question that you'd be asked in an entrance exam to a yeshiva, because that's the kind of thing any third grader would know. That's sort of like common knowledge 101. So here, is it really a test to see how much he knows about the Torah by asking him, what is the greatest commandment in the Torah? It's really what we call in Yiddish a klutz kasha. It's a very clumsy kind of question. So they ask him, what is the greatest commandment in the Torah? And Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind." Now, the actual text in Deuteronomy chapter 6 does not say with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. It reads with all your heart and all your soul and all your might,
right,
or all your strength. So your mind here is, unfortunately, is a bit inaccurate. So Jesus says this is the first and great commandment. And the second, he says, is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend or hang all the law and the prophets. Now, there Jesus would get an A+ in terms of giving a traditional normative Jewish answer. That's very similar to many, many different teachings of the Talmud do when they try to summarize the entire Torah, all of Judaism, on one foot. Those are basically very, very legitimate, accurate ways of summing up all of Judaism. And so it's not really clear here why this would have been a great test. And it's interesting that Matthew here seems to end abruptly. Nothing, that's all that happens. Jesus gives him this sort of very simple answer that any third grader back then could have given, and the story ends. When you go to the version of this story that's taught in Mark chapter 12, it's a little bit different, and it's more full. There's a fuller presentation of the story. First of all, when they ask, what is the greatest commandment of the Torah, Jesus here prefaces this line that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. He prefaces it with the verse that actually appears in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, which is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." He sort of makes a definitive statement there about the unity of God, a very clear monotheistic statement. And then in Mark 12, what happens is the teacher says to him, "You are right." You see, Matthew doesn't have this. In Mark, this is now verse 32, chapter 12, the teacher says, well said, teacher. The man says to Jesus, "Well said, teacher. You are right in saying that God is one, and there is no other but him. To love him with all your heart, with all your understanding, with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all the burnt offerings and sacrifices." So you have here, a story where they come to test Jesus. It's a pretty strange test. It really is not much of a test. Jesus gives the right answer. We would all get up and say, right on, 100%. And Matthew, the story doesn't really conclude, but in Mark, the person says, you got it bang on. It's perfect. One of the things also that's interesting here is that you'll find many Christians, when they speak about the Old Testament, they speak about the binding nature of the Ten Commandments. They always speak about the Ten Commandments. Here, you see that Jesus is not quoting from the Ten Commandments. It's clear that from Jesus' perspective, it's not just the Ten Commandments that are binding. He goes a bit beyond them.
So he basically had, if anything, it moved it up to 12, technically speaking.
Yeah, and actually, he's already given his credence to, honoring your parents. He's spoken about that. There are many things we know that go way beyond just the Ten. Oh, that's in the Ten Commandments. I'm sorry, but he's mentioned other things, and it's clear that from Jesus's perspective, it's not just the observance of the Ten Commandments that counts.
Because he goes on to say, in that same context, he says, "For the law and the prophets hang on these two." I mean, that they exist. They actually are hinging on these two. Not that these two replaced anything. So
exactly, in the rabbinic literature, there are many passages where they try to sort of reduce all of the Torah to one sort of general principle. And so no one is trying to say that everything else is now null and void, but they're saying if you wanted to sum it all up, so to speak, if you wanted to give, the one or two commandments that sort of express everything all together, and that was very commonly done by the rabbis. So Jesus here obviously is not negating the importance and the binding nature of other commandments, but he's saying these basically are the central ones upon which everything else hangs. Now, the chapter here ends, again, with an interchange that really, to me, punctures the credibility of the New Testament, because Jesus again here asks another, clumsy question, and the gospel writer just says that he floors the rabbis, and all the readers applause, and they assume that that's exactly what happened. It's a very, very hard story to understand. So what happens in the end of this chapter, beginning in verse 41.
If Mark.
So no, now we're back to Matthew 22.
Okay, got it.
So all of the the different Jewish groups had their shot at Jesus. The Sadducees had their shot at him. The Pharisees take their shot at him. But now Jesus, gets to ask back. And it says here, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asks them, saying, well, what do you think about the Christ, about the Messiah? Whose son is he? Whose son is the Messiah? And they said, the Messiah is going to be the son of David. And he says to them, well, if that's true, if the Messiah is the son of David, how then does David in the Spirit, meaning speaking with Ruach HaKodesh, with the Holy Spirit of God, how does David call him, the Messiah, Lord? Right? And he quotes here Psalm 110, which I think is the passage in the Hebrew Scriptures most often quoted in the New Testament. He quotes Psalm 110, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. And he goes on in verse 45, if David then calls him Lord, if David calls the Messiah Lord, how is he his son? How is he the son of David? And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day on did anyone dare question him anymore. Right? He's able to vanquish the Pharisees. Now, I want to share the way John MacArthur summarizes this argument. He says, David would not have addressed a merely human descendant. David would not have spoken about a merely human descendant of himself as Lord. Here, Jesus was not disputing whether the son of David was an appropriate title for the Messiah. After all, the title is based on what is revealed about the Messiah in the Old Testament. Many times, he's described as the son of David, as the descendant of David. And it's used as a messianic title many times. But he says, Jesus was pointing out that the title Son of David did not begin to sum up all that is true about the Messiah, who is also the Son of God. The inescapable implication is that Jesus was declaring his deity. Now, again, if Jesus here is clearly declaring his deity, why didn't they get him now? Meaning that why were they looking for these ways of tricking him into saying that he doesn't believe in paying taxes? They could have said right here on the spot, you're claiming to be God. That's enough, to bring you up on charges of blasphemy. Right. So the problem here is this, when you're reading this in English, it does seem to be a strong point. The Lord said to my Lord. And the English reader assumes that Lord here is a term for deity. The problem is that in Hebrew, there are two different words here. The first word, Lord, is the tetragrammaton, where it's the Almighty, the Creator, said to my Lord. But here, it's not the word indicating deity. Here it's the word Adoni, my master. So all you have here is a phrase in Psalm 110 where the Almighty God said to the master of the one that's speaking. Now, it's not clear who's speaking here in Psalm 110, verse 1. If you say that David is speaking, some of the commentaries say that David here is referring to his master, which would have been Saul. Before David himself took over rulership, before he actually was able to take over the rulership and reign, Saul had to basically step aside. So what is possible in Psalm 110 is that God is saying to David, right? David here is speaking. The Lord said, someone here is speaking about David, where the Almighty God said to my Lord, to King David, sit at my right hand, meaning you have to wait until the right here, the word yamin in Hebrew is like the Hebrew word Benjamin, because Saul was from the family of Benjamin.
What verse was that in?
I think it's the very beginning of Psalm 110.
Oh, Psalm 110 guy. Okay.
Yeah, and that's what he's quoting here. So what God is telling David is, you have to just wait until King Saul is no longer ruling, and then I will install you as the king. Some people read this differently, that it's not David referring to speaking about King Saul, but it's Nathan here who's speaking about King David, or someone who is writing this psalm is speaking about King David. So it's again, the speaker here is not necessarily King David. There's someone who's speaking about King David.
It's interesting. They capitalize both of them, of course.
Right, but there's two different Hebrew words, and
Right.
the speaker here would be speaking about David and saying, the Lord, meaning the Almighty God, said to my Lord, and he's speaking about David as his master. And we know, for example, that in 1 Kings chapter 1, I believe it's 1 Kings 1, that's exactly how Nathan the prophet refers to King David as my master, Adoni. So there are numerous ways in which, you could read chapter 110 in the book of Psalms. When you go through the commentaries, there are many ways in which it's read. No Jewish commentary reads it as, indicating that the son of David is going to be God himself.
Right.
And so the fact that Jesus is so easily able to stump these, again, the Pharisees were not, children in the second grade. These were the greatest teachers at the time. They wouldn't have been stumped by this. And so when you see the gospel writer presenting this story where, the Pharisees, these great sages, are so easily stumped by a clumsy question, it sort of, to me, is a red flag that these stories don't have a lot of historical credibility, meaning that it's almost impossible to imagine a group of great sages listening to this question and having no answer for Jesus. I think that it would have been quite simple for them to answer him. And so when the gospel writer presents a story that he was able to shut them up definitively and conclusively with this kind of, simplistic question, it really leaves me with the sense that this really never happened.
Right.
And that the gospel writer is just making up a story that's telling a story that, look how great Jesus is. He's able to shut up and to, vanquish all of the leading Jewish sages. So in general, I go through Matthew 22, and I'm really left, unfortunately, very uncomfortable feeling that there's really much historical credibility to this chapter at all. We'll see if this continues next week with chapter 23.
That sounds good. Rabbi, it has always been fun and a pleasure to work with you. I really appreciate your time. Great chapter as usual. We will talk in the future, of course, about how we're going to handle the other Gospels. So yes. we may have to, in fact, I may even throw a wild card out there now. Rabbi, I think it might be a good show for you to just over the next 3 Gospel writers, you pick what you want to go over, because we pretty much covered the majority of it in Matthew, and then we can kind of move on to the book of Acts, and we'll see how it plays out. Sound good?
I'm thinking along those lines.
I love it. I got that from you, by the way. It wasn't my great idea at all. Okay, Rabbi. Love you. Thank you so much for sticking with us. It's been great. It's been fun. Can't wait to see you next week. Shalom, everybody. TanakTalk.com. Subscribe. Facebook. TanakTalk.ProBoards.com. And don't forget, Jews for Judaism.ca for Rabbi Michael Skobac. Love you guys. We'll see you next time. Shalom, shalom.
Hag Sameach.